One way to predict how much readers will enjoy a text is to measure its readability. Readability refers to how easy a text is to read. If a text is easy to read, readers can focus on the ideas in the text rather than figuring out what the writer wants to say. This comes in different forms. I mean, one aspect of readability is font size, color contrast. That's why stop signs look the way that they do. Bright colors, big bold letters. Um, the font Helvetica has been judged as especially easy to read. That's why you see it on all these kinds of public signs. You see it in corporate logos. Um, and that's also why, word processors, the default's usually Times New Roman or Cambria instead of curls or Edwardian script or impact. That's why usually you see, black letters against a white background. That's something we can keep in mind for our multimodal projects. Here's a couple of writers who've made some style choices that are, interesting, but not necessarily easy to read, right? And this also includes things like font colors. Notice how it's kind of hard to see the white font against that light gray background or black font against someone's dark hair. All right, these are all things that we have to think about in terms of readability. But mostly readability is not about fonts and color contrasts. It's about the language that we use. And there's a whole bunch of formulas that exist to measure the complexity of language, and they've been around since the 1950s. They operate under a pretty simple assumption that bigger language is harder to read, and so they base their formulas on characters per word or letters per word, words per sentence, sentences per paragraph, and then they give you some kind of a grade level average. This is the number of years of education that the average person would need to understand the text according to the formula. There's several different popular formulas. We will, there's also some good sites that kind of run all the tests, all the different formulas at once. Let's look at an example of it here. Okay, so here's a passage we saw in the Good Writing module. It's from Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. Here's how this can work. You take your passage, you copy it, you go to, well, here's a site I'll show you in a moment. It's onlineutility.org. But you basically paste the text into a window, all right, and then you hit process text, and then it gives you basically runs the test for these popular kind of readability formulas. One's called Coleman-Lau, the other one's FK or Flesch-Kincaid ARI, SMOG. That's the standard measure of gobbledygook is what that's called. Anyways, and then you can see that the formulas produce different averages, right? But then if you kind of average these things out, you get the sense that this passage is appropriate for someone in about with about 9 years of education, kind of like or ninth grade, right? Meaning like a high school freshman could understand this. All right. Compare that to this thing from Judith Butler, this passage that won Dutton's Bad Writing Award. And watch what happens here. We go back and we run the test again. Now look at that. All right, there's definitely some variation here, but you average these things out, and you need decades of education to be able to understand this, which, if you think about it, is kind of appropriate. I've been kind of in academia for several decades now, and I'm like, I think I know what she's talking about. Compare this to Fun with Dick and Jane. This is the book that my mom used to teach me to read. Here's the first page of the book. Look, Jane, come and see. See Spot run. Run, Spot. Run. Spot's the dog. All right, anyways, watch what happens when we do this thing here. Well, okay, minus, you get a negative. All right, so if you think about it, like what would like a -3 be? Well, that's about 3 years before first grade, like preschool, when we first start teaching kids to read. You can do this, even for just say your own writing. Like, let me check out how about my blurb here at the beginning of this module. Yeah, pretty simple, right? Kind of like 6th or 7th grade. So, how are these tests, used? How are they useful? Well, first of all, here's one example. Government agencies in the US and the world over require documents to adhere to certain readability standards, usually 8th grade or lower. That's because you shouldn't have to have a high school education to understand what the government is telling you, all right? Publishers rely very heavily on these readability standards. That's partly because they want people to understand what they're reading and all that, but it's also because readability is closely correlated with book sales. And we saw this in the good writing module. Like academic papers, which, are not exactly bestsellers, tend to be pretty high in readability, usually about 16th grade, which, that means you're kind of like heading into grad school, right? But, if we look at other things like Harry Potter or Twilight, stuff like that, it's much more readable. All right. And by the way, it's not just for publishing that this matters. Readability is positively associated with Google search hierarchy and engagement of readers online. Yeah. So in other words, if your stuff is easy to read, people are more likely to interact with it online. It's connected to the success of marketing. And here's the one that blows my mind, even the impact of executive communication on a firm's market performance. Okay, so for instance, you take like an investment firm, the numbers, regardless of what the numbers are and how much money the firm's making, the way executives like talk about the numbers, how clearly they talk about the numbers, will impact things like investor confidence, share price, a lot more. So clearly, readability matters. Readability is also connected with publication rates of scientific articles. But in this case, the relationship is inverse. Yeah, that's right. So that means that the harder something is to read, the more likely it is to get published in an academic journal. This tells us, something about academic writing and kind of what's going on. And there's, clearly there's a disconnect between academic writing and the rest of the world. Why is that? Well, if you look at Steven Pinker, he says it's because of the curse of knowledge, and academics just, have a hard time, picturing what it's like to not know what they're talking about. Other people think this is because of ego or other things, but that's a matter for another module. What's important for us is to really think about the bigger picture. And that is that, what all academics who achieve widespread success have in common, if they're popular outside academia, is that their work is highly readable. And I mean, the list goes on and on, but just this is true of, Isaac Newton, Darwin, Einstein, Rachel Carson, famed environmentalist, Jane Goodall. You may have, read about her work with primates here in this class. Other people we talked about, like Isabel Wilkerson, we saw above, Pinker, Harari, author of Sapiens, Deborah Tannen, the famed linguist. A lot of these people are astronomers. Astronomy is kind of a tough subject matter. People who can explain it clearly have a lot of success. That's true of people like Michio Kaku or Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan as well. Sociologists like Malcolm Gladwell, historians like Rebecca Skloot, and the list just goes on and on. And here's the key point, is that sometimes the academics getting the most attention in their fields aren't necessarily the ones who are the best scientists. It's just they're the ones who are best at communicating their ideas. And Kanazawa is an example of that. Perhaps the most famous person in evolutionary psychology, despite being widely criticized. And, he's got a best-selling book. This thing was published 10 years ago, but it continues to sell. So, when you think about that Kanazawa text, what grade level do you think it is? Is it lower than your average scientific journal article? Well, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to run some tests and find out. And think about how that relates to how much, you enjoy reading this text, regardless of how you feel about the ideas in it. Look, there are limitations to these tests, and one of them is thematic appropriateness. For instance, the test can measure how many years of education someone needs to understand Kanazawa's text without measuring whether it's appropriate for someone. Look at some of the stuff he's talking about in this book. You have to keep in mind, how mature someone has to be to understand this stuff, not just understand it, but you get what I'm saying here. These tests can also not measure implication. You take something like a sentence like to be or not to be, that is the question. Well, that's a very easy sentence to read, but it's, there's a lot kind of going on there, right? I mean, this is my daughter who is in 2nd grade can read this, but is she going to get what's going on here? Probably not. The test can't tell you that. And then also as a writer, you need to be aware that results are funky if you have a short text with a few oft-repeated big words. One time I was writing a short informational text about Newfoundland that was aimed at like a low reading level, like 5th grade. But because Newfoundland is a 12-letter word and it was my topic and I kept repeating it, I was getting really funky results. And that can happen with you as well. Finally, some people argue that readability is subjective. And this one critic gave the example of 50 Shades of Grey. Like, yeah, it's easy to read, but for him it was very hard to read because he hated it. And, so keep that in mind too. But really, what I want to stress in this video is that these readability tests, which you'll practice using in a moment, are a reliable predictor of reader engagement. They've been around for 70 years, and they've kind of proven their worth again and again. We do have to keep the limitations in mind, but really, we can use these things a couple ways. We can think about how readability influences our own engagement as a reader, okay? And are we letting readability get in the way of, say, the truth? And then also, we can look at our own work with a critical mind and ask how much the readability of our work matches our intended audience.